Chapter 4. Crooks, the Negro stable buck, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. On one side of the little room there was a square four-paned window, and on the other a narrow plank door leading into the barn. Crooks's bunk was a long box filled with straw, on which his blankets were flung. On the wall was the window. On the wall by the window there were pegs, on which hung broken harness in process of being mended, strips of new leather, and under the window itself a little bench for leather-working tools, curved knives and needles and balls of linen thread, and a small hand riveter. On pegs were also pieces of harness, a split collar with the horsehair stuffing sticking out, a broken hame, and a trace chain with its leather covering split. Crooks had his apple box over his bunk, and in it a range of medicine bottles, both for himself and for the horses. There were cans of saddle soap and a drippy can of tar with its paintbrush sticking over the edge. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions, for, being alone, Crooks could leave things about, and being a stable buck and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men, and he had accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. It's important to note, right? He lives on his own, right? We're talking 1930s in the U.S. This is racial segregation. It's not a coincidence that he doesn't live with the other characters in the bunkhouse, right? So they're being alone. That is. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single-barreled shotgun. And he had books, too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code from 1905. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large, gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. This room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. Aloof means distant, right? He kept distant from the others because he doesn't trust them. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth, seemed to glitter with intensity. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips, which were lighter than his face. It was Saturday night. Through the open door that led into the barn came the sound of moving horses, of feet stirring, of teeth champing on hay, of the rattle of halter chains. In the stable buck's room, a small electric globe threw a meager yellow light. Crooks sat on his bunk. His shirt was out of his jeans and back. In one hand he held a bottle of liniment, and with the other he rubbed his spine. Now and then he poured a few drops of the liniment into his pink-palmed hand and then reached up under his shirt to rub again. He flexed his muscles against his back and shivered. Noiselessly, Lenny appeared in the open doorway and stood there looking in, his big shoulders nearly filling the opening. For a moment, Crooks did not see him, but on raising his eyes he stiffened and a scowl came onto his face. His hand came out from under his shirt. Lenny smiled helplessly in an attempt to make friends. Crooks said sharply, "You ain't got no right to come in my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me." Lenny gulped, and his smile grew more fawning. "I ain't doing nothing," he said. "Just come to look at my puppy, and I seen your light," he explained. "Well, I got a right to have a light. You go on, get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room." "Why ain't you wanted?" Lenny asked. Lenny doesn't understand, right? I mean, this is important. Lenny is childlike. That's an ongoing characteristic of him. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play because I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, all of you stink to me." Okay, right. So we've got is from the 1930s, got some racism here, right? They won't let him play because of his race. So all of these guys are alone to begin with. Crooks is even more alone, right? We talk about how Lenny and George are unique because they're traveling together and everyone else travels alone. Well, like on top of that, even within a bunch of people who are alone, Crooks is like extra special alone because he is isolated because of his race. So we kind of want to have that in mind as we deal with him as a character, that this is something that he has to, carry as a burden that is different from the other characters. Crooks is even more alone than the other characters because of his race. Okay. Lenny flapped his big hands helplessly. Everybody went into town, he said. Slim and George and everybody. George says I gotta stay here and not get into no trouble. I seen your light. Lenny's lonely, right? He's looking for someone to talk to. Oh, what do you want? Nothing. I seen your light. I thought I could just come in and sit. Crooks stared at Lenny, and he reached behind him and took down the spectacles and adjusted them over his pink ears and stared again. I don't know what you're doing in the barn anyway, he complained. You ain't no Skinner. There's no call for a bucker to come into the barn at all. You ain't no Skinner. You ain't got nothing to do with the horses. So he's saying Lenny's job doesn't relate to horses, so what's he doing in the barn, right? The pup, Lenny repeated. I come to see my pup. Well, go see your pup then. Don't come in a place where you're not wanted. Lenny lost his smile. He advanced a step into the room, then remembered and backed to the door again. I looked at him a little. Slim says I ain't to pet him very much. Crooks said, Well, you've been taking him out of the nest all the time. I wonder the old lady don't move him someplace else. The old lady, meaning the mother dog. Oh, she don't care. She lets me. Lenny had moved into the room again. Crooks scowled, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. Come on in and sit a while, Crooks said. So we've got a change here. Now Crooks is willing to talk to Lenny because, again, Crooks is lonely, and he starts to realize that maybe Lenny doesn't mean him any harm, and so he's starting to let his guard down. Guard down a little with Lenny, realizes that Lenny is different from the others, and he is, I can't type, sorry, and he is lonely. Okay. As long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well sit down. His tone was a little more friendly. All the boys gone into town, huh? All but old Candy. He just sits in the bunkhouse sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring. Crooks adjusted his glasses. Figuring? What's Candy figuring about? Lenny almost shouted. About the rabbits! You're nuts, said Crook. You're crazy as a wedge. What rabbits you talking about? The rabbits we're going to get, and I get to tend 'em, cut grass and give 'em water and like that. Just nuts, said Crooks. I don't blame the guy you travel with for keeping you out of sight. Lenny said quietly, It ain't no lie. We're going to do it. Going to get a little place and live off the fat of the land. Crooks settled himself more comfortably on his bunk. Sit down, he invited. Sit down on the nail keg. Lenny hunched down on the little barrel. You think it's a lie, Lenny said, but it ain't no lie. Every word's the truth, and you can ask George. Crooks put his dark chin into his pink palm. You travel around with George, don't you? Sure, me and him goes every place together. Crooks continued. Sometimes he talks, and you don't know what the hell he's talking about, ain't that so? He leaned forward, boring Lenny with his deep eyes. Ain't that so? Yeah, sometimes. Just talks on, and you don't know what the hell it's all about. Yeah, sometimes, but not always. Crooks leaned forward over the edge of the bunk. I ain't a Southern Negro, he said. I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, about 10 acres. The white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I even went to play with them. And some of them was pretty nice. That should be my old man. Let's see, typos in this. My old man didn't like that. I never knew till long later why he didn't like that, but I know now. He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. There wasn't another colored family for miles around, and now there ain't a colored man on this ranch, and there's just one family in Soledad. He laughed. If I say something, why, it's just an N-word saying it. Basically saying that no one is going to trust him because of his race. No one is going to believe what he says. Lenny asked, How long you think it'll be before them pups will be old enough to pet? This classic Lenny here, right? I mean, Crooks is telling him this sort of maybe deep into his life story, and Lenny's like, but what about the puppies? What about the puppies? Crooks laughed again. Guy can talk to you and be sure you won't go blabbing. Couple of weeks and them pups will be all right. George knows what he's about. Just talks and you don't understand nothing. So again, Crooks is lonely and he thinks maybe he has found someone he can talk to safely because Lenny isn't really going to understand what he says anyway. So Crooks is excited to have somebody talk to because he is lonely. Lenny won't understand what he says. Anyway, he leaned forward excitedly. This is just an N-word talking and a busted back N-word, right? So it's even worse, right? It's not just his race, but geez, he's injured also, or he's crippled because of his back isn't straight. So he thinks this no one values Crooks feels like no one values him, and so um, he thinks that maybe this is his opportunity to find someone who will talk to him. So don't need nothing, see? You couldn't remember it anyways. I seen it over and over. A guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if you don't hear or understand. The thing is, they're talking, or they're setting still not talking. It don't make no difference. No difference. Right? Just the point is that they're talking. He misses having somebody to talk about. This idea of loneliness. Doesn't even matter if no one, I know it's not how you spell loneliness, is it? There we go. Doesn't even matter if no one understands you. It's just the idea of having someone to talk to is what he misses. His excitement had increased until he pounded his knee with his hand. George can tell you screwy things, and it don't matter. It's just the talking. It's just being with another guy. That's all. Highlight that also again. Loneliness. His voice grew soft and persuasive. Suppose George don't come back no more. Suppose he took a powder and just ain't coming back. What'll you do then? Lenny's attention came gradually to what had been said. What? He demanded. I says, suppose George went into town tonight and you never heard of him no more. Crooks pressed forward some kind of private victory. Just suppose that, he repeated. He wouldn't do it, Lenny cried. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I've been with George a long time. He'll come back tonight. But the doubt was too much for him. Don't you think he will? Crooks's face lightened with pleasure in his torture. This is a weird thing that Crooks is doing here, right? Why is he trying to play this trick on Lenny? I think we have to come back to that idea of power that we talked about, right? Crooks doesn't have power over anybody because he is, he's mistreated because of his race. And he sees that maybe here's someone, maybe, in this sort of power hierarchy of the ranch, maybe Lenny, despite the fact that Lenny is white, but because of Lenny's cognitive differences, Crooks feels like maybe he could have power over Lenny. And he kind of likes that feeling that maybe here's somebody that he could have power over. Make a little note of that here, right? So Crooks is excited to find another person that he has more. I don't know that he's doing this necessarily to be cruel. It's just more like the circumstances that they're in. Nobody can't tell what a guy'll do, he observed calmly. Let's say he wants to come back and he can't. Suppose he gets killed or hurt, so he can't come back. Lenny struggled to understand. George won't do nothing like that, he repeated. George is careful. He won't get hurt. He ain't never been hurt because he's careful. Well, suppose you don't come back. What'll you do then? Lenny's face wrinkled with apprehension. I don't know. Say, what you doing anyways? He cried. This ain't true. George ain't got hurt. Crooks bored in on him. Want me to tell you what'll happen? They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with a collar like a dog. Right, so he's saying, well, they'll take Lenny to some kind of insane asylum or kind of terrible place that they would take people in the 1930s. So he's trying to scare Lenny. Suddenly, Lenny's eyes centered and grew quiet and mad. Now we know what happens when Lenny gets mad. So Crooks doesn't know this yet, right? He doesn't know what Lenny just did to Curly, but he's about to find out that maybe he shouldn't mess with Lenny. He stood up and walked dangerously towards Crooks. Who hurt George? He demanded. Crooks saw the danger as it approached him. He edged back on his bunk to get out of the way. I was just supposing, he said. George ain't hurt. He's all right. He'll be back all right. Lenny stood over him. What you supposing for? Ain't nobody going to suppose no hurt to George. Crooks removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with his fingers. Just sit down, he said. George ain't hurt. Lenny growled back to his seat on the nail keg. Ain't nobody going to talk no hurt to George, he grumbled. Crooks said gently, maybe you can see now. You got George. You know he's going to come back. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure, you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you had to go read books. Books ain't no good. The guy needs somebody to be near him. Right? Okay. So again, he's talking about this loneliness. So keep going. He whined, the guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is, long as he's with you. I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. Again, back to this theme of loneliness. I'm having a hard time spelling that word. There we go. So yes, I mean, this Crooks has so much experience with this because he can't even find companionship with the other guys on the farm because of his roots. George's going to come back, Lenny reassured himself in a frightened voice. Maybe George come back already. Maybe I better go see. Crooks said, I didn't mean to scare you. He'll come back. I was talking about myself. The guy sits alone out here at night, maybe reading books or thinking or stuff like that. And sometimes he gets thinking, and he got nothing to tell him what's so and what ain't so. Maybe if he sees something, he don't know whether it's right or not. He can't turn to some other guy and ask him if he sees it too. He can't tell. He got nothing to measure by. I seen things out here. I wasn't drunk. I don't know if I was asleep. If some guy was with me, I could tell me. He could tell me I was asleep, and then it would be all right. But I just don't know. Right? So he's saying, he's seen things, and he doesn't know if he was dreaming or what, and he doesn't have anybody to ask, like, hey, did that just happen? Because he doesn't have anybody to talk to. Crooks was looking across the room now, looking towards the window. Lenny said miserably, George won't go away and leave me. I know George wouldn't do that. The stable buck went on dreamily. I remember when I was a little kid, my old man's chicken ranch had two brothers. They was always near me, always there. Used to sleep right in the same room, right in the same bed, all three. Had a strawberry patch, had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out in the alfalfa on the sunny morning. My brother did, my brothers had sat on a fence rail and watch 'em, white chickens they was. Gradually, Lenny's interest came around to what was being said. George says we're going to have alfalfa for the rabbits. What rabbits? We're going to have rabbits in a berry patch. You're nuts. We are too. You ask George. You're nuts. Crooks was scornful. I've seen hundreds of men come by on the road and on the ranches with their bindles on their back and that same damn thing in their heads. Hundreds of them. They come and they quit and they go on, and every damn one of them has got a little piece of land in his head, and never a goddamn one of them ever gets it. So he's saying, I've heard this dream before, right? Crooks is really skeptical that George and Lenny could pull this off because he feels like he's seen other people do this and they never actually get it. So I'm gonna make a little note here, right? Crooks doesn't think the dream is realistic. He has seen lots of other ranch hands with similar dreams, and they come to nothing. So, just like heaven, everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody gets no land. It's just in their head. They're all the time talking about it, but it's just in their head. He paused and looked toward the open door, for the horses were moving restlessly and the halter chains clinked. A horse whinnied. I guess somebody's out there, Crooks said. Maybe Slim. Slim comes in sometimes 2, 3 times a night. Slim's a real skinner. He looks out for his team. He pulled himself painfully upright and moved towards the door. That you, Slim? He called. Candy's voice answered. Slim went in town. Say, you seen Lenny? You mean the big guy? Yeah, seen him around any place? He's in here, Crooks said shortly. He went back to his bunk and lay down. Candy stood in the doorway, scratching his bald wrist and looking blindly into the lighted room. He made no attempt to enter. Tell you what, Lenny, I've been figuring out about them rabbits. Crooks said irritably, You can come in if you want. Candy seemed embarrassed. I don't know. Of course, if you want me to. Come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger, right? So, like, he pretends he's got this gruff exterior because he's trying to protect himself because people have been so mean to him. But, like, really, he's excited that he's got so much company. So this definitely tells us a little bit about Crooks, right? Crooks tends not to want people around because they hurt him emotionally. But really, he is excited to have company. Andy came in, but he was still embarrassed. You got a nice cozy place in here, he said to Crooks. Must be nice to have a room all to yourself this way. Sure, said Crooks, and a manure pile under the window. Sure, it's swell. Right, he doesn't really mean that. It's not that great. He's just been complaining to Lenny about it. Lenny broke in. You said about them rabbits. Candy leaned against the wall beside the broken collar while he scratched the wrist stump. I've been here a long time, he said, and Crook's been here a long time. This is the first time I ever been in his room. Crooks said darkly, Guys don't come into a colored man's room very much. Nobody been here but Slim. Slim and the boss. Candy quickly changed the subject. Right? He's uncomfortable with this. Slim's as good a Skinner as I ever seen. Lenny leaned towards the old swamper. About them rabbits, he insisted. And he smiled. I got it figured out. We can make some money on them rabbits if we go about it right. But I get to tend him, Lenny broke in. George says I get to tend him. He promised. Crooks interrupted brutally. You guys is just kidding yourself. You'll talk about it a hell of a lot, and you won't get no land. You'll be a swamper here till they take you out in a box. Hell, I seen too many guys. Lenny here'll quit and be on the road in 2, 3 weeks. Seems like every guy got land in his head. Candy rubbed his cheek angrily. You goddamn right we're going to do it. George says we are. We got the money right now. Yeah, said Crooks. And where's George now? In town in a whorehouse. That's where your money's going. Jesus, I seen it happen too many times. I seen too many guys with land in their head. They never get none under their hand. Candy cried. Sure they all want it. Everybody wants a little bit of land. Not much. Just something that was his. Something he could live on. And there couldn't be nobody to throw him off of it. I never had none. I planted crops for damn near everybody in this state, but they wasn't my crops. And when I harvested them, it wasn't none of any. It wasn't none of any harvest. But we're gonna do it. And don't you make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. The money's in the bank. Me and Lenny and George, we're gonna have a room to ourselves. We're gonna have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're gonna have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat. He stopped, overwhelmed with the picture, right? So make a little note here, right? Again, this is the dream, right? Everybody wants a little piece of land. That's really important right there. And Crooks reinforces this idea that this is a common dream. It's not like Lenny and George are unique in wanting this, but maybe it is going to actually be attainable. And if we want to come back, right? I mean, this is almost that idea of the American dream, right? Being able to have your own land, have your own, support yourself, all of these sorts of things. There's a tie-in with that as well. I'm just going to make a little note of that. Why don't want to let me just make another note. There we go. American dream. Crooks asked, You say you got the money? Damn right, we got most of it. Just a little bit more to get. Have it all in 1 month. George got the land picked out, too. Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. "I've never seen a guy really do it," he said. "I've seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land, but every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes." He hesitated. "If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, why, I'd come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled I can't work like a son of a bitch if I want to." "Any of you boys seen Curly?" You know who that is. Who's always looking for Curly? It's Curly's wife, right? They swung their heads towards the door. Looking in was Curly's wife. Her face was heavily made up. Her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly, as though she had been running. "Curly ain't been here," Candy said sourly. She stood still in the doorway, smiling a little at them, rubbing the nails of one hand with the thumb and forefinger of the other, her eyes traveling from one face to another. "They left all the weak ones here," she said finally. "Think I don't know where they all went? Even Curly. I know where they all went." It's important, right? They left all the weak ones here. So we've got Lenny, we've got Candy, and we've got Crooks, who are all in various ways handicapped, different from everybody else. She's not very nice to them. So Lenny, Candy, and Crooks are all different from the weak. Lenny watched her, fascinated, but Candy and Crooks were scowling down away from her eyes. Candy said, "Then if you know, why you want to ask us where Curly is?" Yeah. She regarded them amusedly. "Funny thing," she said. "If I catch any one man and he's alone, I get along fine with him. But just let two of you guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad." She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. "You're all scared of each other. That's what. Every one of you's scared as the rest is going to get something on you." After a pause, Crooks said, "Maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble." "Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't like to talk to somebody every once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time?" Okay, so again, loneliness, right? She is lonely also. Curly's life is also okay. Candy laid the stump of his wrist on his knee and rubbed it gently with his hand. He said accusingly, "You got a husband. You got no call fooling around with other guys, causing trouble." The girl flared up. "Sure, I got a husband. You all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he? Spends all his time saying what he's gonna do to guys he don't like. And he don't like nobody. Think I'm gonna stay in that 2x4 house and listen to how Curly's gonna lead with his left twist and then bring in the right cross? 1-2, he says. Just the old 1-2 and he'll go down." She paused, and her face lost its sullenness and grew interested. "Say, what happened to Curly's hand?" There was an embarrassed silence. Candy stole a look at Lenny. Then he coughed. "Why, Curly, he got his hand caught in a machine, ma'am." "Bust his hand." Sorry, there's interesting typos in this book. Yeah, it should say bust his hand. Um, Remember that's the lie that Slim told Curly to tell. Otherwise, it would be embarrassing for Curly to admit what really happened, and so they come up with this lie so that Lenny doesn't get in trouble, that he got caught in a machine, even though we know that really Lenny crushed his hand. And she's suspicious, right? She does not think that's actually what happened, but she doesn't know. She watched for a moment and then she laughed. "Baloney. What you think you're selling me? Curly started something and he didn't finish. Caught it in a machine. Baloney. Why, he ain't give nobody the good 1-2 since he gone and he got his hand bust. Who bust him?" Andy repeated sullenly. "Got it caught in a machine." "All right," she said contemptuously. "All right, cover it up if you want to. What do I care? You bindle bumps think you're so damn good. What do you think I am, a kid? I tell you, I could have went with shows, not just one neither. And the guy told me he could have put me in pictures. Right, she means movies, right? She said she could have been on stage, she could have been in movies. Um, so that she thinks she's better than they are. She was breathless with indignation. Saturday night, everybody's out doing something. Everybody. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs, she means like, ranch hands, and an N-word, and a dum-dum, and a lousy of sheep and orange, uh, because they ain't nobody else. Right? So again, she's stuck talking to them because she's lonely. But she doesn't know what to do other than to be kind of mean to them. If she was nice to them, that might be better. Lenny watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro, but a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. I had enough, he said angrily. You ain't wanted here. We told you you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas on what us guys amounts to. You ain't got sense enough in that chicken head to even see that we ain't stiffs. Suppose you got us canned. Suppose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy two-bit job like this? You don't know what we got, that we got our own ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't got to stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this. And we got friends. That's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we was scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land and it's ours and we can go to it. So he's talking about the dream. Now, of course, they don't have it yet, but still, this gives him this sense of pride, right? A sense of pride, a sense of hope, and something to stand up with, all right? So the dream and feeling like they are about to actually achieve it gives Candy hope and something to stand up for. And, you can't push me around anymore. I'm not just your average ranch hand. I'm going to have my own land one day. But she doesn't buy it, right? Says Curly's wife laughed at him. Baloney, she said. I've seen too many of you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, why'd you be in getting 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass? She's talking about drinking. I know you guys. So she's saying the same things that Crook said, right? I've seen this before. I don't think you can actually do this, right? So Curly's wife says the same thing as Crooks. She had seen this dream before and doesn't think it's realistic. Andy's face had grown redder and redder, but before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of the situation. I might have knew, he said gently. Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got, and we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you better just scatter along, 'cause Curly maybe ain't gonna like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs. She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her, and she looked longest at Lenny until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly, she said, Where'd you get them bruises on your face? Lenny looked up guiltily. Who, me? Yeah, you. Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. He got his hand caught in a machine, he said. Curly's wife laughed. Okay, machine, I'll talk to you later. I like machines. Candy broke in. You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I'm going to tell George what you says. George won't have you messing with Lenny. Who's George? She asked. The little guy you come with? Lenny smiled happily. That's him, he said. That's the guy, and he's going to let me tend the rabbits. Well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple of rabbits myself. Crooks stood up from his bunk and faced her. I had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out, and get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more. She turned on him in scorn, right? power dynamics here, right? He tries to tell her what to do, but she's fully aware that she has power over him. She says, "Listen, N-word," she said. "You know what I can do if you open your trap." Crooks stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and he drew into himself. She closed on him. "You know what I could do." Crooks seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, you keep your place then, N-word. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny." She could, if she were to say that he tried to touch her, that, I mean, she's making a reference basically to the possibility that she could get him lynched, if she could get him killed, if he, if she wanted to. This is pretty sinister what she's doing here and how she's using her power over him. So she is threatening to get Crooks lynched. And she knows full well that people won't believe him, people will believe her. Knows that. Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was toneless. This is really sad what she's done here, right? How much that fear is ingrained in him of what she could possibly do and how much it changes him. So this as a dramatic. So Curly's wife is an interesting character because on the one hand she's lonely and she's unhappy and she's not treated very well, but she does not hesitate to lash out at those that she knows she has some power over, like Crooks. It's, again, all about that power hierarchy on the ranch. For a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crooks sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. "If he was to do that, we'd tell," he said quietly. "We'd tell about you framing Crooks." "Tell and be damned," she cried. "Nobody'd listen to you, and you know it. Nobody'd listen to you." So, right, she knows they won't listen to these two either. Again, power. She's got power over them. They're old. They're not valued because they're the weak ones, like she said. Um, so yet another reason why she feels like she has power. Andy subsided. "No," he agreed. "Nobody had listened to us." And so he knows that she's right. Lenny whined, "I wish George was here. I wish George was here." Candy stepped over to him. "Don't you worry none," he said. "I just heard the guys coming in. George will be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet." And he turned to Curly's wife. "You better go home now," he said quietly. "If you go right now, we won't tell Curly you was here." She appraised him coolly. "I ain't sure you heard nothing." Better not take no chances," he said. "If you ain't sure, you'd better take the safe way." She's saying, "You don't want to risk Curly thinking that you were out here." She's clearly a little bit afraid of Curly too, right? We don't see necessarily what their dynamic is as a couple, but you can assume that she does not feel safe with Curly necessarily. She turned to Lenny. "I'm glad you bust up Curly's hand a little bit. He got it coming to him." It's quite a thing to say about your husband. "Sometimes I'd like to bust him myself." She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some horses snorted and some stamped their feet. Crooks seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put back on. "Is that the truth, what you said about the guys come back?" he asked. "Sure, I heard him." "Well, I didn't hear nothing." "Gate banged," Candy said. And he went on, "Jesus Christ, Curly's wife can move quiet. I guess she had a lot of practice, though. Crooks avoided the whole subject now. Maybe you guys better go, he said. I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man's got to have some rights, even if you don't like 'em. Candy said, that bitch didn't ought to have said that to you. Not a nice word for her, but then again, she's not very nice, so wasn't nothing, Crooks said dully. You guys coming in and setting made me forget. What she said is true. It's tough. He knows that it's true, it's not fair. He liked having company, but now he's realized that that's not realistic, and that he still lives in this society where that's not possible for him. All right, so Crooks liked having the company, Candy and Lenny, but Curly's wife's comments made him remember that he won't be treated fairly by society. Okay. The horses snorted out in the barn and the chains rang out, and a voice called, Lenny! Oh, Lenny, you in the barn? It's George, Lenny cried, and he answered, Here, George, I'm right here. In a second, George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. What you doing in Crooks's room? You hadn't ought to lie here. Crooks nodded. I told him, but they come in anyways. Well, why didn't you kick 'em out? I didn't care much, said Crooks. Lenny's a nice fella. Now Candy aroused himself. Oh, George, I've been figuring and I got it doped out how we can make some money on them rabbits. George scowled. I thought I told you not to tell nobody about that. Candy was crestfallen. Didn't tell nobody but Crooks. George said, Well, you guys get out of here. Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute. Candy and Lenny stood up and went towards the door. Crooks called, Candy, huh? Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs? Yeah, said Candy, I remember. Well, just forget it, said Crooks. I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that. Is he telling the truth here? No, right? But again, he's really had the sort of wind taken out of his sails with Curly's wife's comments and his realization of the situation, and he's feeling less hopeful, like he could really actually join with them. So he did mean it, but now he realizes the improbability of that dream, and he doesn't want to get his hopes up. Well, okay, if you feel like that. Good night. The three men went out of the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment, and then he reached for the liniment bottle. He put out his shirt. He pulled out his shirt and back, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, fell slowly to rubbing his back. So he goes back to what he was doing before. Right? That's the end of that chapter.